Like many Canadians, I've watched with just a little bit of alarm as our politics have become more extreme. And I'm wondering why and what kind of an ism we can attach to it. Is it fascism, populism, some other hybrid form? So I want to talk to Stewart Prest, who's a political scientist at Simon Fraser University about that. So welcome to the interview, Stewart.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, look, I'm particularly interested in this because our beat is energy and climate, and this kind of extreme politics seem to be most intense in oil and gas producing regions like Alberta and Saskatchewan. And of course, they're tied to COVID-19 with the anti-vax protests, and another beat that we've been working on lately. So how extreme are they? I mean, should we be concerned about this?
Well, I mean, there are different ways to answer that question. We certainly are in a phase of politics where folks seem like they are more angry about more things. There does seem to be that sort of some of the veneer that we would associate with politics. Some of that has been stripped away. More people are more willing to confront politicians directly outside of formal gatherings and so on. So it seems like there is an anger there that perhaps hadn't been in previous eras, but we can also look back to some previous periods of time where we have seen similar cycles of frustration, and they're often associated with the kind of politics that we might generally call populism. This idea that there is a sense that some group of people are concerned about the corruption or the downfall of some set of institutions. And we have populism of the left and populism of the right historically in Canada. So it's not just something that is owned by one particular ideology, although I think it seems pretty clear that the thing that people are most worried about these days is the sort of populism emerging on the right, which is tending to focus therefore on the corruption of or the perceived corruption, I should say, of core institutions, of big government and that sort of thing, and that the idea that government has lost touch with the interests of some group of people, sort of defined as the true people or the real interests of the country. And so you often get this kind of dynamic of the interests of the heartland versus the elites out there somewhere. And so that can be associated with some pretty destructive politics. We have seen some of that in Canadian history, and of course, we've broadened the lens to other countries. It can get quite a bit worse, but we also have some sense that there are real limits on how far these movements currently are growing in Canada and how far they've gone historically in Canada as well. So I think we can draw some conclusions, some comparisons between some of these other destructive forces in politics, but I don't think we want to overextend that analysis either.
Okay, fair enough. But things are, I'm old enough to have lived through a few decades of politics and elections and so on. And I've never seen anything like Donald Trump. And given what happened on January 6th, where the Capitol building was overtaken, and it appears clearly at the instigation of Trump, plus the way he conducted himself as president, plus the way they're all, the extreme politics that seem to be coalescing around the Make America Great Again movement. And the way now it appears that this Trumpism is bleeding across the border into Canada's right-wing politics. That seems to me to be a different animal. It doesn't appear that, in my observation, that this is just another kind of wrinkle on, right-wing Canadian populism. Am I right or wrong here?
Well, I think we can break that down a little bit. I think it is fair to be quite concerned about what we saw in the United States under Donald Trump. I think that's a reasonable thing to be concerned about. What you saw is a politician who was effectively willing to undermine the game itself, to really fly in the face of the rules of the game if it meant an opportunity to try to hold on to power. I think that's a fair characterization of what we saw. And there were, in some ways, more disconcerting in the United States. There were many Americans who were willing to turn a blind eye to that practice, or even to try to support it in various ways. The good news is that when the decisions mattered most, say with the counting of votes in Georgia, those sorts of things, where officials were put in a place, including Republican officials, were put in a place where they had to make a final decision. They made decisions that were supportive of democracy, but it was a little too close for comfort. I think that's definitely fair to say. And the violence of January 6th is further evidence of the sort of wearing down of some of the guardrails of democracy that we have relied on in the American context. So that willingness to go beyond sort of the accepted bounds of discussions, to challenge the very notion that this is a fair practice, those are worrisome developments in the United States, and the extent to which what happened on January 6th is being downplayed in American politics today. I think that's fair to be concerned about that too. These are important issues, and then they're serious ones. And to the extent that Republicans are not grappling with those issues seriously now, there's a cause for concern. We see that conversation affects what is happening in Canada. We know that there are connections between discussions that happen in Canada and the United States, but it's not always going to be a one-to-one comparison either. It's pretty clear that there are influences, cultural influences on the way in which politics is evolving in the United States that are seeing echoes here in Canada. But we also know that it's not a one-to-one comparison either, where in the United States, the Republican Party continues to enjoy broad support. It is not exactly the party of the majority anymore. In a lot of contexts, it is enjoying less than half the support of the country, but it's still a significant force. In Canada, when we see these views being expressed, they are sort of a fraction of a fraction, where a clear majority of Canadians are not accepting of these kinds of practices. So some of those guardrails are quite a bit thicker here. So right to be concerned, but it doesn't mean that we're going to see Canada follow exactly the American path.
Well, it doesn't, but there's certainly cause for concern. I mean, 4 years ago, if you had asked someone about what might happen, if you had been able to show them the future and what would happen in early 2021 to a Republican supporter back in 2016, they probably wouldn't have believed it. And here we are. There's the old saying that whatever happens in the US eventually 5 years later shows up in Canada. Mm-hmm. And what do we have? We've got the Maxime Bernier and the People's Party of Canada. I think the word revolution escaped his lips a few times during the last election campaign, and we see white supremacy on the rise, racism on the rise. I'm not suggesting that Canada is where Trumpism is up here, but we sure seem to be following in the same footsteps.
I mean, we're following in some of the footsteps, and I don't want to try to underplay the rightful concern about a lot of these developments. We do see significant upswing in things like violence and discrimination targeting, say, Asian Canadian populations here in Vancouver. This is a real concern. We see incidents are way up. So there is clearly a sense of backlash against racialized communities, and particularly where a narrative has developed, say, early on in the COVID crisis, this erroneous blaming of Asian Canadians as some sort of vector for the virus, when the truth is quite distinctive. It's coming across the American borders, coming from Europe, coming from just about everywhere, but Asia by and large. So there is something to be concerned about, but I think we also want to turn our gaze to consider what are some of those other guardrails that we find in Canadian politics. So as we see someone like Maxime Bernier embracing some of that revolutionary talk and a seeming willingness to play fast and loose with those guardrails of democracy, we also see someone like Aaron O'Toole, who is actually making some progress. It was a halting progress, but in terms of trying to tap into a desire for moderation on the part of a lot of Canadian conservatives. And the conservatives are basically debating right now what kind of direction do they want that party to go in, to try to recapture the vote that Bernier has spirited away, to the extent that there is an overlap there. And it's pretty clear that some of Bernier supporters are just disaffected Canadians who have previously tuned out, but now they find someone willing to champion their views. It's not clear that they would have voted Conservative anyway. So they're having those kinds of conversations in the Conservative Party. There's also feeling that pursuing that more moderate course opens up a variety of new possibilities for the Conservative Party, and that O'Toole could continue with that moderating project in the next election. So there is a polarization of Canadian society, and there is a divide and some skepticism about the sort of the democratic or modernizing project that we've been engaging in for some time. But those lines in some cases run, say, through a federal Conservative Party, and we can't. And there is a large cross section of the population that tends to embrace wholeheartedly things like vaccine mandates, robust state action in support of shared communal goals. So we see that resistance, but in some cases it may just be a backlash to a direction that society is continuing to move in.
Now, I've been playing a bit of devil's advocate to your objective academic approach to this, and I appreciate the fact that you're taking the emotion out of the conversation. So the last thing I want to talk about is Jason Kenney and the United Conservative Party in Alberta. There are all sorts of things we could point to where Mr. Kenney has taken the government of Alberta in directions I don't think anybody expected, and we just look at the way he's mishandled the pandemic and the public inquiry, so-called, into anti-Alberta energy campaigns. Which is that a one-off? Is it Mr. Kenney's personality plus the volatile politics of Alberta that have been around for decades? Or is this something, is this the thin edge of the wedge that maybe Trumpism might get like the beachhead in Canada?
I mean, it's an interesting question where we see Mr. Kenney, it seems like he has been trying to ride something of that populist wave, but to try to turn it towards his own political ends. And so he's been at times willing to embrace some of the symbolism and some of the language of those kinds of campaigns, almost as if he's something of a tactical populist, right? And willing to try to appear in a pickup truck and to try to show himself to be one of the common people, but at the same time having a clear, in some ways highly ideologically motivated project around government, and so those two things don't always fit together well if he's not going in the direction that the populist movement wants to go. And on top of that, there does seem to be hard to describe anything other than a failure of fundamental governance ability, governing competency there, where whether it was unwillingness to accept the severity of COVID and the Delta variant, for instance, and respond to the changing circumstances, there was a certain flat-footedness there where the government wasn't responding to the situation as it actually existed on the ground, rather sticking to their plan for how things ought to roll out during this last summer, for instance, in terms of a pandemic response. And they're really paying a penalty for that now. Simply, we're not exactly it's a question of populist or not, but is this good governance or not? And it was not effective governance, and the health system is under tremendous pressure as a result. And the party and Mr. Kenney himself are pretty clearly paying a significant political price, at least at the moment, for that. They are not terribly popular. The NDP has surged to renewed popularity in recent polling, and so to an extent it is again people interested in government that can simply meet the challenges of the day and not necessarily engage in either populist symbolism or ideological positioning, but simply govern well. And there's still time between now and the next election for Mr. Kenney to retake that mantle of good governance, but it seems like, at least for the moment, he's lost it. And that's not to say that these populist undertones to politics or the polarization of politics won't continue to be an issue in Alberta, but it is not going to completely eradicate interest in the importance of these other issues as well.
Well, let's wrap this up, Stewart. Should Canadians be not concerned, moderately concerned, or very concerned about this extremism that we've talked about, and particularly places like Alberta? So how concerned should we be?
I think it's fair to be. It's a bit like the game I play with my kids when they're upset about something. And big deal, little deal, no deal, right? Is no deal at all. And that's with my kids. Usually the answer I'm aiming for it, so we can handle it. I think it's fair to say that this is a somewhat of a deal, right? Where we see that, particularly where we see that thinning of the grounds of civility is a loaded term, so I don't know if I want to use that, but the sense that we have mutual respect for the positions of others, and we are willing to engage in some sort of bounded conversation and accept that there are differences of opinion. Democracy exists to choose a direction forward on the basis of these differing views, and that once a decision is taken, we go in that direction for a while on the understanding that the next time around we'll have another discussion, and maybe a different view will win out, and then the champions of that view, another political party, will get a turn to try to take us in a different direction. There seems to be less acceptance of effectively willingness to lose an argument, and we see that play out in a variety of ways. A lack of respect for media is one thing, where we are hearing about a spate of increased violence and stalking and so on of media figures and politicians who are coming in for much more direct attacks. Those kinds of instances are concerning and suggests that the differences of opinion are not simply going to remain that, but they may become grounds for increased action. So I think we want to really emphasize that there has to be a bound for shared discussion. We may differ even on the fundamental understanding of facts, and that seems like that's a part of our politics, but we have to accept that at the end of the day, different views are going to be heard. We're going to have a fair process by which we adjudicate between these views, notably in elections. And then once those processes are complete, someone's going to have a chance to govern, hear about it, whether they get the answer right or wrong, and then we're going to have another vote. And when we start to take the discussion beyond those points, that's when I think it's fair to be concerned that we are stepping outside the bounds of democratic norms.
Well, Stewart, I'm very curious to know your views on how significant and disruptive change is the kind that we see today. We're moving change in our global energy system and our economy, and there's some parallels with what the significant change in the 1920s that gave rise to fascism in Europe. So what is the role of this wrenching disruptive change on extreme politics?
Well, it certainly can have an effect, and it can take a variety of different avenues. So one is if people are being displaced from the systems and the economic practices that they've come to rely upon, then suddenly they are looking for perhaps new answers and even new lifelines to help them make sense of politics and help them to continue forward. So displaced populations, economic dislocation can be a factor that reshapes politics and then perhaps radicalizes individuals. So that's one possibility. We can also see that it can create, as an extension of that, opportunities for politicians who are willing to offer up relatively simple, more simplistic answers for complex problems. They may get more attention than they would normalize. People who are, again, looking for a way to reassert control over lives and trying to make sense of very unsettling times. And so we can see that play out in various ways. An unwillingness to accept the complexity and the difficulty of responding to a global pandemic, and then the disheartening finding that it may just be with us for some time, and we may continue to have to take robust interventions. That's not easy to hear. And so for a certain subset of the population who are already distrustful of institutions due to, say, that sense of economic dislocation, there may be increased responsiveness to someone saying, actually, no, there's a truth being hidden from you, and I can tell you about this new thing called ivermectin or some other magic cure, or that there is essentially some kind of conspiracy behind what's going on. So that willingness to embrace much more radical interpretations of what is happening in the world, there is that increased openness. Once it develops, you can develop these alternative political cultures, and we see that the presence of an online environment makes that in some ways even easier than, say, the 1920s, where these different ecosystems of information can create themselves and continue to thrive. And once they establish themselves, it becomes very difficult to to counteract them. Right? There's a certain subset of the population now that is absolutely convinced that ivermectin is going to be a more effective cure. No amount of scientific evidence seems like it can dissuade them. Even Mr. Kenny himself cannot dissuade people at a certain point. He has come on record to say that actually no, this is for deworming animals. That has nothing to do with a global virus, and yet the belief persists even when someone from within that tent is telling them otherwise. And so, so in some sense, we have a dislocation matters. We have this different information environment can matter, and it can become very very difficult to counteract once it establishes itself. So I think there's a couple of grounds for real concern there. But it is also, it runs up against real limits, right? So there's only so large a proportion of Canadian society that is really open to those appeals. And in a place like Alberta, that population may be larger. We may look for cultural explanations for that, whether it's a certain distrust of governing institutions to begin with. We know that that's a longstanding element of some veins of Alberta politics. Alberta is also on the cusp of arguably a much greater dislocation than other parts of the country. Canada is going to move towards a decarbonized economy, relatively speaking. It will not be fully decarbonized, but that is the direction we're going. And when that happens, it's going to have a larger impact on Alberta than anywhere else in the country. And we're starting to see some of those effects already. And so it's, in some sense, inevitable that dislocation is going to create more diverse politics as a result. So we may be seeing some evidence of that happening already in terms of distrust of those who are describing what is going to happen in the province.
Well, Stewart, thank you very much for your dispassionate and clear-eyed view of this topic. Really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.